Thank you. Last October, I was visiting Scotland for a conference, and I took this picture of a castle. This is in Stirling, very close to Edinburgh, and this is called Stirling Castle, very original. And this castle, I was walking around here a little bit, and at some point I entered a chamber, and there were very beautiful tapestries hanging on the walls. So you can see, better keep this one. You can see one here. This is a series. It is called The Hunt of the Unicorn, or For the Unicorn. It's a very famous series of tapestries. And there was an exhibition about this specific series of tapestries, and suddenly my eyes fell upon the word cartoon, and I didn't really expect it there. So what was the case? Actually, in medieval times, the word cartoon was first used for a study for example, tapestries or stained glass in churches, or for murals on the walls. So they made these studies on very rigid paper or sort of cardboard. And in Italian, this is called cartone, in my best Italian. And in Dutch, it would be carton. And that's why they started to use the word cartoon for sort of a preliminary study for example, tapestries. So people like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael and other artists, they all made these cartoons. So, and this will be of importance later on when I explain why the modern cartoon is called a cartoon. So now we skip a few centuries. This is the 18th century, and this guy is called William Hogarth, and he is seen as one of the pioneers of modern cartoons, but they weren't called cartoon at this time. So these are depictions, actually they are engravings, and what this guy, William Hogarth, did, he was also a painter, but he experimented a little bit with series or sequences of panels, and that was quite new. So he was trying to tell a story using a sequence of different drawings. And it was already sort of a comment on societal issues, not maybe as much as you see in cartoons these days, but he was commenting on political situations, for example. So that was what he did. What he also did was using speech balloons. They look slightly different than the speech balloons that you see these days. These are more a little bit like flags. But it's very early use of this same principle of people are talking, and then you write the text in a little balloon that's attached to them. I'm not going to explain these cartoons because you need to know the whole historical context, which I don't know, and it would also take a little bit too long. Well, in the same century, still the 18th century, there was also someone else. This man is called James Gilray. He's also from Britain, and he made a lot of what were still not called cartoons yet, but these satirical depictions. So maybe it's good to first explain satire, because satire was already a thing, let's say, in the 18th century, but it was more in, for example, theater plays and in books. So the idea was that you were exposing or ridiculing certain persons or governments, or what we would now call cooperation, with the intent to improve the situation or mankind or society. But it wasn't really very structural, so it was more like saying, hey, this is wrong. You don't say like, you have to do this, this, and this, and then the societal issue is solved. But it's more like kicking against something, and then maybe people get ideas and you're going to solve issues. So that was the role of satire, I would say. But to use it in this way in cartoons, or what would later be called cartoons, was new. And this cartoon here by James Gilray is has become quite famous. So you see on the left side, you see Napoleon Bonaparte, and on the right side, you see the Prime Minister of Great Britain, or Britain, William Pitt the Younger, if I remember it well. James Gilray was from Britain, so he was against Napoleon. So he always depicted him as a very small man. And small was then, of course, a sign of sort of weakness. And you can also see that they're chopping up this pudding, which represents the globe. And you can see that Pitt the Younger is actually cutting off a much bigger part. Now, the power of these cartoons became clear in what Napoleon Bonaparte said about this. So when he was in exile, later on he said that these depictions by James Gilray, that they damaged him more than a dozen generals. And that was really because he was shown as weak. And you might wonder, I might wonder, sorry. Need to drink something. Who actually saw these depictions of Napoleon? Were really a danger for his status, let's say. So it was not that all the working class people would see these pictures. In the 18th century, it was more of a thing of the upper class, the elite. So there would be, for example, these connoisseurs, if I pronounced it correctly, people who were very into the fine arts, and they would, for example, after a dinner, share these kind of pictures. But of course, since important people, it was important what the elite thought. So if they would see all these pictures, then you had a problem as one of the big names out there, being Napoleon. And the normal people, maybe they would see it, for example, when they gathered around the windows of a print shop. But it wasn't like later on when cartoons were printed in a newspaper. Where's the thing? Yes, so now we arrive in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, there were a lot of weekly magazines and newspapers coming up. This was really the time when this became something big. And it played a huge role in the development of cartoons. So here you see, and I also brought a book here that you can check later after this lecture. Here you see the magazine Punch, which was issued from, let's say, halfway the 19th century. And this magazine, they brought the news in a sort of a satirical way, but they also had a lot of illustrations in there. And they were actually the magazine that at some point came up with the word cartoon. And you will see here cartoon number 1. You can see it above the picture. And this was because at that time they were painting the Houses of Parliament in London, and they were creating these murals on the walls. Or if you say a mural, it's already on the wall, I guess. And the preliminary studies that they made for these murals, they put them outside the House of Parliament so that the working class, the normal people could see what they were doing. And these preliminary studies, they were called cartoons. So then Punch magazine, they appropriated this term because they were making sort of political drawings and they saw a link there. And because Punch magazine was hugely popular at that time, it led to sort of a widespread use of the word cartoon for this phenomenon. Again, I will not try to explain this whole cartoon, but you can see that the drawing style is quite different from what we know as cartoons look like these days. This guy on the left is John Leech, one of the important cartoonists for Punch magazine. He was also an illustrator. For example, he created illustrations for Charles Dickens' Christmas carols. And actually quite a few of these cartoonists who drew these cartoons for Punch magazine, they were also illustrators. So John Tannill, for example, he made illustrations that are quite famous for Alice in Wonderland. I also have the book somewhere over here and over there. These are still, I think that 90% of all the books named Alice in Wonderland are still printed with these specific illustrations, which are originally engravings, by the way. Yes, so like I said, newspapers were coming up and these news magazines. And maybe you know the term editorial cartoon. And this word editorial cartoon comes from the spot where they would first start to place these cartoons, these political cartoons. So the editorial page was the page in a newspaper where the editorial board would write an editorial. So a piece written by the newspaper itself, let's say. And on that same page, they would place a cartoon. So that's why it was called a Editorial Cartoon. And you might wonder, up till this point, I was really talking about these typical satirical, political cartoons. But you also have these very funny comic strips. That is a sequence of panels, or this way for you. And what about these sort of comic strips or cartoons? Where did they come from? Now, these newspapers, as I said a few times, they were coming up in the 19th century. And there were huge battles going on between newspapers because they wanted to have the biggest circulation, they wanted to have the most readers. And actually, one way to distinguish yourself from other newspapers was to publish more, better, funnier cartoons than the other newspaper. So this is the New York Journal, which was already there at the end of the 19th century. And they were, I think, competing with the New York World. Hard to distinguish if you have names like that, but this is an example of a very early comic strip. So here you actually see, you already see it in the use of color and the very childish cast of characters. He also was, he's called Rudolf Dirks. He originally came from Germany. And he was one of the first to use a fixed cast of characters in his comic strips, and they would have these silly adventures. And of course, it was a very, let's say, low-level entertainment. It was not very deep or not very political. But this was the way to sell more newspapers. So these forms, the comic strip, which is a sequence of panels, and this political cartoon, which was actually called a gag cartoon, so that's one panel, they stayed more or less the same over the next century or a half. So I will skip a few years. And here we are in the 90s. You can read this comic strip first. So maybe some of you know this comic strip. So this is by Bill Watterson, and some people call this the last great comic strip. It was quite deep and it had some philosophical layers to it. Not necessarily this one, maybe, but yeah, there were lots of these comic strips that he created that had more depth than just a silly joke. It was about everyday life and all kind of problems that people have, but then, yeah, brought in very lighthearted and funny way. The thing was that at some point he said, okay, I think this whole comic strip thing is actually dying around the 80s or 90s it was. Because you had all these huge newspaper syndicates. And a newspaper syndicate, they own the rights to, for example, news articles and columns and cartoons. And they resell, or they sell reprints of this content. So what happens, these were profit-driven, and they create actually quite cheap content. So there was including the cartoons. So they were very bland, predictable cartoons for that reason. So he said he also quit after 10 years, and then he didn't make comic strips anymore. He said, okay, it's over. This doesn't work anymore. Now, luckily for him, and maybe for us also, this is what happened to newspapers. So the circulation of newspapers was going down near the end of the 20th century. And, well, maybe for some reasons that is sad, but for other reasons it's good news. Because the internet, of course, became a lot bigger around the time, which had everything to do with this decrease. And the internet gave quite some new opportunities for cartoonists to find their own audience. So suddenly you didn't have these restrictions anymore where a newspaper that, for example, also has advertisers that maybe put some pressure on them, that would put some restrictions on their art. So I think if there are researchers here, they might know PhD comics, for example. It's a very specific audience. So these are cartoons, and the target group is mainly starting researchers or researchers in general. And this guy, George Cham, he already started in 1997, and he was quite successful. So according to Stanford, he had a website that was visited like 6 million times per year. I don't think a newspaper can easily compete with that. And especially when social media became bigger, then of course it was even easier to reach his audience. So here's an example of one of his comic strips. Yes, so this guy is George Cham. Now, the internet might also have some downsides when it comes to cartoons. So in recent years, of course, cartoons were in the news in a very bad way. And actually, this event, I will not tell the full story here because it takes a little bit too long, but if you're interested, I can answer it during the questions. But this cartoon caused the New York Times to stop printing cartoons in its entirety. And it's a bit of a weird story. But I think that one big factor actually was that as soon as one person starts to say, hey, this is offensive, then he or she may be right, but then very soon it will circulate around the internet and a lot of people will be outraged about this, and then suddenly you have a huge problem. So try to remember this if you're interested in it. Well, that's me again. So now I will start talking about my own work. So you've seen a little bit of about the history. And I think before I really go into trying to explain to you how you can make a great joke, I need to explain, especially for the people who are not familiar with my work, what I actually do. So this was the first cartoon that I published. It's in Dutch, sorry. So the first cartoons that I made as a cartoonist were for a newspaper called Witty, which was at the time the newspaper for the University of Twente, and they hired me as a cartoonist after they'd seen some drawings that I had an exhibition at the university here, and then they called me and said, "Hey, are you interested?" So I said yes, and then I became in 2016 cartoonist, and the first series of cartoons I made was about a fixed set of characters, a rat and a mouse, which represented two lazy students. And these cartoons were printed in the news magazine by UT News, and they were also shared on Facebook. Now, near the end of the first year that these were printed, I felt like, they seemed to work in the beginning, but after a year, I was, of course, counting the likes on Facebook, and I thought, I don't know if this is still working. Something is going wrong here. And at that point in time, actually, UT News was also transitioning into U Today, which what they are called now, and the concept changed a little bit. So they focused more on their website, and then they made some magazines besides that. So my new cartoons, or from that point on, would be put on the front page of the newspaper and also on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. So I thought maybe it's time for a change. So I started to think, and I have all these books, as you see there, so I got a lot of inspiration, and I don't necessarily have to draw like this. So first I looked a little bit into different drawing styles. I took some inspiration definitely from these very old cartoons from Punch. But I also realized I really love this these kind of drawings, which almost look again like engravings. But it's one thing to sort of manually redraw these cartoons, but it's another thing to actually create them yourself, and you have to have a lot of knowledge about shading and the specific drawing technique. My problem actually was I was trying to analyze what was maybe going wrong with the rat and muis cartoon, and I thought, first of all, as you notice, it was in Dutch, and we have a lot of international students and staff here, and most of them cannot read it, so that might be a problem. Secondly, they had text, which could be a problem these days on social media, so you actually have to take time to try to understand it. A third thing was I didn't use color. And I think if you use color, you have more possibilities also to stand out, for example, on the front page of a website or on Facebook. And the fourth thing was that I had this fixed cast of characters. So all my jokes had to be about this mouse and this rat. And I had a lot of other ideas actually about the campus, and it was hard for me to make cartoons about it if I had to stick to these characters. So that was the same for the cartoons that I just showed you. The two, they still were about persons, and I had all other ideas in my mind. So the cartoon, oh yes, we still had this guy here. So at some point I was watching a documentary about somebody called Christoph Niemann. He is a German, well, not necessarily cartoonist, I think a visual artist. He, for example, made some covers for the cartoonist also. And he creates a lot of different types of illustrative art. But he also made this cartoon, and I saw this in the documentary, and I thought, whoa, this is actually quite a strong message with such extremely simple, two extremely simple elements. But it's quite touching in a way. I thought it was quite impressive that without any words and with such a simple drawing, you can create so much effect. So what I tried to do from that point onwards is create cartoons without text. Let's see. So my first cartoon then was this one, in which in case I will explain it shortly, if you're familiar with the campus, you know Torentje van Drinelo, or the Tower of Drinelo, the little church that's towering above the water. And all I did was add some imagination to it to show what's beneath the water. And then some little details, for example, the guy who's waiting at the door, who's looking very solemn, and to make it slightly funnier. But I will talk about these details later on. Yeah, so that was my drawing style, and this is Dinking. This is, I think, also the drawing style that most people know from me. And I was wondering myself, like, why do I have this drawing style? And also, where does it come from? So here you see two examples of cartoons. You can read the one on the right, behind the god. It's one of my favorite cartoons. So it says, "Oh no, a morning person," at the bus stop. So you can guess I'm not really a morning person. So you can see a huge difference between the cartoon on the left, which is from the 19th century, and which is drawn in a very, it's a very technical drawing, but it's also very serious and drawn in a very classic way, and all the proportions of the people are quite normal. And the one on the right is super exaggerated, and everything looks weird. The noses are way too big. Every line that you see there is drawn in a sort of a miserable way, so that even if you only look at the picture, I think for most people it has some sort of hilarious effect. So I do not draw like the one on the left, and I also don't draw like the one on the right. I guess I'm somewhere in the middle. So where does my inspiration come from? Well, for example, when it comes to characters, I take a lot of inspiration from these Disney kind of characters, especially the old ones. So again, I have a book here. Most of these Disney animals that have these human characteristics, they walk on their hind legs, and they have very thin legs and very big feet, and they have those eyes that are very close together to make them look more cute. And I like that style a lot, so that's what I use for characters mostly. Then another very big inspiration is Hergé, who created Tintin, or the Adventures of Tintin. And I was a big fan of these comic books when I was younger, so probably it had an effect on me, even though it wasn't intentionally, let's say. So he was the founder of something that is called ligne claire. Ligne claire. And in English, it would be clear line. So that style, the name was actually coined by a Dutch cartoonist called Joost Zwarte. But Hergé was the founder of it, let's say. So the thing with these comic books about Tintin is that the lines, the way they are drawn, they're evenly thin. Let's say they always have the same sort of thickness, and the contrast of the colors is really downplayed, and you don't have cast shadows, for example, so the shadows of a character. And this creates a very open and transparent drawing. And there were lots of people who followed in his footsteps. And I think that my cartoons are pretty much similar to this drawing style, so clear line. Then I also take inspiration from other stuff than comic books or cartoonists. So I really love these Art Deco posters from the 1930s. Well, I will stop saying this, but I also have some stuff over here like this. And also Japanese prints. And both of them are actually quite balanced compositions. And this is also, I thought, okay, I take inspiration from this, but I'm not sure what I'm actually taking, which elements. And then I started to understand that what I do mostly when I make a cartoon is that I'm actually trying to create a little piece of art instead of just putting some characters in there and then have some crappy background and a little nice, funny drawing. To me, it's very often more, and I try to create some sort of composition that would make sense as an artwork on itself. So you can also see it in the colors if you would compare it with some of the Art Deco posters. And you see this tree that's creating some extra depth. This trick is used a lot, I think, in these Japanese prints. I also use that sometimes in my cartoons. So that was about the drawing style. Now I didn't talk about how I create a joke yet. So first I will show you very quickly through which steps I go when I draw a cartoon, just to make you understand it. So first, I always draw on paper. So I make a sketch on paper, then I take a picture, and then on the computer, okay, I will try to explain. Oh, I know, I forgot to bring something. Okay, so this is called a drawing tablet, for those who have never seen it before. So what I do is I walk to my computer, I attach this thing, and then I use a pen, which I forgot, to draw or to redraw the thing that I just sketched. So you have different layers. I make the photograph, you can see it on my screen, and then I redraw it with a pen. This thing is connected to the laptop, and I see the lines on the screen. After that, I color the drawing, also using this, but this is in Photoshop, and the lines are in Adobe Illustrator. So this is all done digitally. So, okay, those are the 3 steps, but this, of course, tells us nothing about how the joke really comes to life or how it comes into existence. Okay, so I've been thinking, of course, when I started creating cartoons, a lot about how can you try to create a cartoon in a structural way to create a higher production. So when you say structural, you say Excel. So I created all these lists of topics. So I had columns in which you can see locations on the campus and different student activities like Klotefiets. UT bachelors, all the study programs, and different themes that I could maybe use for my cartoons. And I thought, okay, if I connect them, then I might come up with a joke. Well, that didn't really work. It's a nice list. You can cross off some subjects that you already made a joke about, but it doesn't really inspire or create some connections, I have to say. So I wonder what the next slide is. Okay. I've changed the slide so many times. So I will show you now how I can create a cartoon, and I will use these 2 whiteboards. So we've experimented quite a lot with if you can see it if I draw. So I hope this will pay off. So let's say I wanted to create, where did I leave? I wanted to create a cartoon about Studium Generale. And it's not going to be as bad as when I tried to create a cartoon about you today. It's a bit of a disaster. So the way I start is actually without any idea in mind. So if I don't have an idea in mind, I just start to draw. So I would say, okay, what do I see here? We have the floor, we have me standing here with the legs, and then you have you in the audience. No offense. Okay. So we don't really have a joke yet here. I think we can agree on that. So I start thinking like, okay, so what would be happening here? Maybe I need to determine at which point in this whole event this is taking place. So I would make a second drawing. If I do this, then you will see it again. So this is me again, walking onto the stage. And I say, okay, this is at the beginning. So maybe I'm going to talk to you, like I do now. And this is you again. Okay. So I still don't really have a joke here. So maybe I'll come up with something if you actually say something and there's some sort of interaction. I draw myself again. Here is you. Now, I'm saying something, probably reacting, although this is illogical, because if you ask a question, I would probably put it on that side. Still don't have joke. Okay, so maybe if I move the location, so let's say now we are having a conversation while I'm standing here and you are over there. But now comes into mind that also after the presentation, you can, for example, ask a question to me. So let's see if that brings in some ideas for a joke. So let's say, for the sake of clarity, this is a she with a hat on, and this is me. And then she is asking something, and I am answering. Hey. So now suddenly, because I drew this particular drawing, an idea comes up in my mind, and I think, I know this situation in which, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, in which a person comes up to the slightly, at that point, sort of, I wouldn't say famous, but there's one person who has been standing here all the time, and then you're going to ask a question. And then there are some people who don't really ask a question, but they actually talk for a long time, and then they want to hear the confirmation. So they talk, and then maybe the speaker says, exactly, and then they're gone. And then they've heard what they wanted to hear, right? So that's something that pops up in my mind when I see this drawing, and I think, oh, this is an element for a joke. So that would mean that I would have to cross this, so there's only a question. Now, we have a nice element to start with, but this is not really a joke yet, because it doesn't really work as a cartoon yet. So since the main element here is that there is a woman who is talking for a long time, first thing that I would have to do is to exaggerate. So maybe I should create 3 panels. And then I would say, okay, you have the 2 persons, one with the hat. And she's talking, she's still talking, and then he says, exactly. I know you can read it. Okay. Still not really, it doesn't really work. So maybe since still, I think it would make it funnier if it was actually more stretched, because the longer she's talking, the more awkward it gets. So I would go for a 6-panel cartoon, for example. So there's a lot of hats to be drawn. Hats and hats. Oh no, actually. Okay, so what I could do is I say, okay, she's talking, she's talking, she's talking, she's talking, and then here I say, exactly, and then she passes me. So it also has to be clear that she's walking away. So we switch the 2 persons, and then she's walking away. Okay, see you later. Okay, so this starts to look like something. Maybe I always think that if you make it more dry, or if you try to imply more what the joke is, it works better. So what you could also do to make it more abstract is, this then would be the last iteration. I could also give it a caption, for example. So I could say, the interactive part. Active part. Why do I write? You cannot read it anyway. So, So that will be the caption. Then again, I would draw the whole thing. Oh, that's 8 suddenly. Maybe 8 would work even better. I guess, apart from that, the interesting thing about this is if I say the interactive part, you already assume that probably they're going to talk, and maybe it's not even necessary to fill these text balloons with any substantial text. Maybe I can just draw lines like this is text, but who cares what she's saying? It's going to be in my nightmares. Oh no, there's still too many. Let's say, oh, she was leaving. Yeah. Okay. So I would only have to create these text balloons without any text. And I think I would have to put in the exactly, because otherwise if I say one thing and there's no text, then it's a bit hard to understand. So I would say exactly here. And also she doesn't really have to say anything anymore. It's like she could just walk away. And then I could play around a little bit with their facial expression, for example. Now I'm not particularly known for drawing people in a very natural way, because mostly when I... this doesn't work. We already figured it out. When I draw a head, it consists of one line and then 2 eyes in it. But even if you have 1 line and 2 eyes, I will try to draw it here. I can create some desperate expression. So I could put that, for example, at the end. So I could play around with this for a few more hours, but the element stays the same. So the joke actually started to come in here. So what actually happened here, and this is the thing that I try to explain here, is that the joke sort of comes out of nowhere, but it is because I just keep making random iterations. So I keeping random changes to my drawing. So from here to here, the thing that I did was I changed, let's say, the time at which it's taking place. So I said, oh, this is the beginning. Here I changed some roles. Here I said, oh no, maybe I'll change the situation or the location. I said we do the questions at the end. And still all this time I had no idea what the joke was going to be. But because I just kept drawing, at some point I drew something that made me realize, hey, here is an interesting situation, right? So sometimes I read these tutorials about how do you create a cartoon? And then the first step is create a storyline. And the second step is draw it. So, of course, I mean, how do you create a storyline? That's the whole problem. Well, this is how you could do it. And of course, there's more nuance in it because I showed this to somebody already, and he said, like, okay, well, you might wonder, why do I come up with the idea here? Maybe it is because I get easily annoyed by all kind of stuff. So when people are asking questions that take too long, if I get annoyed, that gives me more fuel for jokes, let's say. So that can also help. But in essence, this should help you to create a joke, and this is the way I do it. So, okay. Now I will try to analyze a few of the cartoons that I already made. So some of you will recognize them and others will not. So I need to explain them before, which is of course a bit annoying to explain your own joke, but it's logical because my target group is mostly the students and staff here. So it's not always understandable for everybody. So the first 2 cartoons that I will show you illustrate that there are actually 2 main factors that are of importance, or 2 criteria that I keep in mind at all times. And one is, what is my target group? And with that comes, what is their prior knowledge? So if they don't know anything about the subjects that I'm drawing a cartoon about, why would I draw the cartoon? Because they will never get the joke. And then the second thing is, that's very important when I judge my own cartoons, like I have a message or a joke in mind, and does it actually convey that message? So it's very tricky because as soon as you have the joke in your head yourself, you might think that somebody else will understand it, but if you don't communicate it very clearly, half of the people who see it will not get the joke. So is the audience actually able to, even if they have the potential to understand it, can they understand it because I bring it in a clear way? So the first example, this one. So I guess most students at least will get the joke because you have a lot of students and staff, or I might be the only one, who have a swap bike, which is a bike that you rent, and it has a blue front tire. So this became hugely popular over the last couple of years. And because of that, suddenly a lot of bikes that you see here in the bicycle racks have this blue front tire, which makes it very hard to find your own bike. So you see this guy here who is searching for his own bike. And so the prior knowledge, I think, was all right, although I heard some people say, like, I've never seen these bikes. So I thought, have you been living on a rock or something? But okay, if you don't know it, you don't see it, right, sometimes. And then regarding if I communicated the message clearly, I think this one worked quite well because I only have one person in there. There's no real distraction. It's in the center of the cartoon. He has clear body language, like, I don't know, what am I doing? He's clearly sort of searching for something. Now you might wonder, what is a tree doing over there? This is probably an example of what I was telling you earlier on, that I try to create a nice composition so that the tree itself is a little bit, it's an extra. It's not necessary to get the joke, but still I like to put in an element like that to create some extra depth and to make it more like an artwork. So this one worked well, I guess. Then we have this one. So whose initial thought was it that this is the barrel of a gun? Okay, it's still okay, but that was one of the problems. So whose initial thought was it that this is a selfie stick? Okay, yeah. So, well, the funny thing here is that I didn't realize during the whole process that you could mistake it for the barrel of a gun. But actually, in the background, you see someone doing the dab, which was at that point very popular, especially when somebody else makes a photograph. But if you don't know about the dab, you'll actually think probably that he's hiding for a bullet. So that even makes the whole idea stronger that it's the barrel of a gun. And one other aspect that might make it confusing is that most photographs, even though we have Instagram these days, I think it's more easy to recognize a photograph if it is either landscape or portrait. And this is a rectangular picture, so you already have less of a reference to a photograph. So a few things went wrong here. And it's actually funny because I think this is one of the first to pop up if you type my name, and then maybe some people see this thing that I draw, guns pointing at my own university. So these are two criteria that I was talking about. And I can also talk a little bit about different approaches that I took to create a cartoon. It's really hard to explain sometimes because the way I describe, I did this and this in the cartoon, but the way it came into existence was, of course, different than me just thinking, I will add something to this aspect, and then suddenly we have cartoon. But that was what I just tried to show you. So now we'll just go for the shortcut, let's say. Yes. In this cartoon, you see a lecture hall. This is in Ravelijn, one of the buildings of the University of Twente. And this is actually the ideal situation for me because I was there once, probably once indeed, but I was following a lecture. And then what you see is, because of the way the building is built, you have a bike lane behind the lecturer. So especially in the summer when it's quite light outside and the inside is quite dark, then you will be watching the lecturer, but you also see a moving object constantly. So you'll go like this. So I can't say that it's smart, that it's built really smartly. And that is just what I tried to illustrate here. So I didn't have to add anything. Maybe I made, of course, the cyclist a little bit bigger than he would actually be, but I didn't even have to exaggerate that much. Then we have this one. So this is the first year, the first week after the introduction period. And a lot of students are quite wasted after that introduction period. So, so I wanted to depict that situation. And if I didn't exaggerate here, then of course it wouldn't be work as well. So here I drew sort of exactly what is happening. So people are really wasted, but probably they're not puking and they're not, well, actually the one that has those, what do you call them? Bubbles above him, he's actually green, but because of the colors you can't see it. So I exaggerated a bit here, but still I didn't really have to add anything creative to it. Now this is sort of exaggeration 2.0. So here, this is about another building. One of my favorite things is to roast buildings. So this is the building Carré, and it's quite hard to find your way in Carré. So if you want to find a lecture room or an office, you don't really know where to go. So I took it to the next level, and I thought I'd make it impossible to actually find a room. So I took inspiration from M.C. Escher, the Dutch artist who created these drawings of impossible buildings. And then I took elements from the building Carré, and I also made it impossible to reach another level of this building. So here, this is also an exaggeration, but I got an extra element into it, being this M.C. Escher work. Take some time to read this one. So here, the main message is people at the festing bar drink a lot of beer. And what I use here is sort of a sequence. And I've done that more often, that you use time or chronological order to build up, and then the joke sort of drops. So here you are sort of guided into the wrong direction. So you think, oh, this is about the height of buildings, using meters to express the height of the building. So the first two buildings are at the campus, and the third one is standing in the center of the city. And then suddenly it changes, and it's not about normal meters anymore, but I think it's centimeters, right, in festing bar. You don't know? Is it the wrong audience? Okay, I heard here somewhere. So they also use the term meter, but then it's about how you get the beer served. Okay, so infinite amount of beer. And so it's all about exaggeration, as I already tried to explain. This one cartoon I already explained. Next two cartoons illustrate a little more that if you take a very recognizable element, it's already easier to make a joke like this, so everybody knows the situation as it is, the church above the water, and then suddenly, oh, surprise, there's something under it. And I did the same thing for the building, the gallery. And so when I see this, I think, oh, this is a UFO. So I added all kind of aliens to it. But of course, because the building itself, people who work at the campus will immediately, or study here, will immediately recognize it. So then it has an extra strong effect, I think, when you create, when you do this addition. Sometimes I also use a parallel or a metaphor for a joke. So here you've probably heard people say our planet is ill or sick or whatever. So I took that element and I elaborate on it. So I thought, okay, if the planet is ill, then I can put her or him, I don't know, in a bed. Oh, and then to make it even stronger, it's a bed in the hospital. So that's in itself, so that's sort of a joke, but I needed to add some elements to strengthen the metaphor, let's say. So I thought, okay, what happens in a hospital? Well, you get visitors. So then if the planet is in the hospital, who's actually visiting her, let's say? Well, maybe another planet and the moon. So there's Mars and the moon. So it's a little kind of, I don't know if this is funny. It's actually quite sad, of course. But it's to illustrate that I used the hospital as sort of a metaphor. Hey, this is my most recent cartoon. So this is actually a parody on the mission, vision, and strategy of the University of Twente called Shaping 2030. So I was trying to read the thing, and then I thought, oh, there's a lot of interesting words in this that that sort of distract a little bit from the message. Now, I know that for most students especially, but also a lot of staff, I think, they haven't read this document, so it's a little harder to get what it's exactly about. But this is a nice way to introduce you to it. And I thought on Facebook it didn't work that well, and maybe it was a little bit underappreciated. So for all of you, after the lecture, I brought a Sheeping 2030 board game, which was based on the game of the goose, as it's called in English, or Gansbord. So you can actually play it. So you use a few pawns and a dice, and then you can end up on, for example, let's say transformational leadership or challenge-based signature. I think, we got to the last part of this lecture, and what I want to talk about is actually the relationship between science or the university and cartoons and illustrations and humor. Because a lot of the assignments that I did besides my cartoons for the newspaper were for educational or research ends. And I'm wondering myself, like, what kind of role could my drawings, but also humor in general, play in bridging the gap between society and university? Because there's a lot of talk about this, like, oh no, people pay tax and I have no idea what we're doing at university, so we need to explain some stuff. And there you can popularize science, for example. That's a way to bring it to a large audience. So I will quickly show a few examples of work that I did that illustrates a little bit what I already did to sort of reach a larger audience. And then if you have questions or if you have any ideas about the subject, I'm really interested in it. So a conference, if you go to a conference, there's very often also a poster. The poster on the left is a poster for a conference in Cambridge. Well, I don't know if I see that. Besides getting depressed, I also, I don't really want to go there. It's super boring and not inspiring. Also, if you would want to show that to somebody else, I don't care where you go. So when I was asked to create a poster for a conference, I put a lot of effort into creating little references to Cambridge and to Japan, about which the conference was. And it's a sort of a conversation piece. So even if you don't really like cartooning, I think it's appealing and you can talk about this. And if it's somewhere on the table, you'll probably take a look and say, hey, what's this? The university promotes itself in all kinds of ways. For example, if you want to do a master here, you can stumble upon a document like this, talking about depression. So it's of course quite boring. And of course, marketing does all kinds of different things to get students. So it's not all of this stuff. But at some point, I was asked to create the cover of a magazine about the study program electrical engineering. And then together with the program director, we created all these ideas about what the future would look like if you use electrical engineering or if you have electrical engineers at work. So it's a very inspiring and funny cover. And there are a lot of Easter eggs in it. And again, I think it's sort of a conversation piece. A thesis. So before you get your doctorate, you have to write a thesis. And it's quite common, I think, in the academic world to have these very formal documents, maybe even more in the United States and the UK. So you could easily mistake them for something like a testament. Or so that's the one on the left, what it would normally look like. And people here have some freedom to actually make it look different. So for a friend of mine, I designed this cover for his thesis, which is, it's not really a cartoon, but things are going on here. So again, something you can talk about. There's a little funny reference to his looks because there's a little character there and there's something going on with the scale. So it's funny, there's some humor in it. You can talk about it. Now here we have one of the best ways probably to bring science and research and education at the university to a larger audience, because who doesn't like a solar car? It's fast and there's competition and drama and it's red. So yeah, so what can you add to that? So I was asked to make some visuals for the solar team, and it's quite a challenge to not to make it better or anything, but okay, how can you maybe reach different audiences? So maybe little children will be inspired by this personification of the solar car, which is taking selfies or which is making a vlog, probably what a lot of children are making, are watching vlogs these days, and maybe their parents are more inspired by this. So these are all examples of, I think, how you could reach a larger audience. And again, I would be very interested in your ideas on this. And you can also send me messages later on, or you can come to my office at the university. This is really something that that I'm interested in. Like, how can I use my work to bring science to a larger audience? That's it, folks.